this example that we're using of Frank, right? The way he introduces it is he says, what a grandiose prick I was, which means I was so full of rage at this grocery delivery woman, that I wanted to tear into her as soon as she arrived. When we unpack that slowly, I know because I see this so frequently in my own practice, is what we hear is, to your word, a sense of entitlement, right?
Entitlement is a sense of domination. Okay, so they're activated. So something happens that activates them, that presses the button of anger, rage, resentment. That activation connects to what's unconscious, that hurt, broken little child that was crushed, neglected, abused. And so when someone is frustrating them, they have to come up with a narrative that they are the victim and that person deserves to be hurt, because that is how they coped. Dysfunctionally, yes. As a child, there was no love. There was no respect. There was no tenderness. There was no nurturing. The way the child coped in such a horrible attachment environment was to be all of everything to himself and to protect himself. And all he has is that. And as an adult, you have power. You can be abusive. You can be intimidating. You can cut people off. And that reaction, the narcissistic injury, is how they justify their distorted thinking.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm interviewing Ross Rosenberg, psychotherapist, educator, and author of many articles and 2 books, The Human Magnet Syndrome and The Codependency Revolution. Ross's work focuses on overcoming codependency and narcissistic abuse. I invited him on the show to talk with us about narcissistic abuse. Hello, Ross. Welcome. I'm glad you're here with us, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about narcissistic rage and abuse.
Well, I am really, really pleased to be here. Especially, I love the title of your podcast, The Narcissist Decoder.
Thank you.
I was in military intelligence and worked with actual real decoders. I was just a Morse code interceptor, but I love it.
Well, before we talk about narcissistic rage, I think maybe we could take a step back and set the stage, because we want to look at what those explosive reactions look like. But before we do that, I know you've also written about something, and I quote, narcissistic injury. So maybe that's a good place for us to start. What role or what's meant, we could say, by narcissistic injury?
Okay, to understand narcissistic injury, I need to take a couple steps backwards. So you have to understand the etiology or the path where it started it all. How does a pathological narcissist, someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, get there? And they have to undergo tremendous trauma, attachment trauma, that is basically going to break them down and create this deep well of core shame that is so big that the only way that their brain can survive it is by cordoning it off, putting it offline, disassociating it, and placing the actual memories of that harm, that abuse, that deprivation in their limbic system, so it's not accessible. But when someone suggests that they're not good enough, they made a mistake, or they don't give them what they want in the moments that they need it, they have this immediate, almost electrical shock feedback that connects to the unconscious material of how horribly they were treated, and they respond with rage. The rage is the adult who now feels that they can protect themselves and stand up for themselves. So the person who is the narcissist, who has a narcissistic injury, is expressing rage that is fortified and comes from core shame that they can't accept and ever know, and this belief that they have to hurt, control the person that somehow is hurting them. And more often than not, it's made up. It's a shame response.
Wait, let's dwell on that last point. So you said it's made up. I'm very interested in that piece. What's actually made up? Does that mean they're not being shamed, or did you have something else in mind?
Okay, so when we think of a narcissistic injury, it could be anything benign as not smiling, not mentioning their name, or it could be something like calling them a jerk. But the narcissistic injury is a reaction to what is perceived as negative treatment, disrespect, disregard. And that connects to the unconscious material that is put away that only allows rage, the rage response, the anger response, is what the narcissist believes is their ability to take care of themselves and protect themselves. They
Okay.
couldn't do it when they were children. When you correct a narcissist and they blow up with a narcissistic injury, that's the child that they once were that is expressing that rage through the adult's voice.
hmm Hey, let's play around with this. I love clinical examples. Can I give you you reminded me of something when they
Sure.
don't get something that they're expecting. I did a couple of podcasts many, many months ago on Frank. I was listening to another podcast of a famous therapist, right, who has a whole model of treatment, and he had Frank on, or Frank had him on his show.
Right.
And Frank told a story where he ordered groceries,
Right.
and he set up his whole evening around accepting these groceries at a certain time.
Yeah.
And the grocery delivery was late.
Right.
So he found himself pacing back and forth, getting himself into what we could call a rage, right? Like
Right.
he's cursing first at himself. What an idiot you are. You just keep waiting. The delivery just keeps getting put off longer and longer. You could have been doing something more productive with your time. But he didn't mention this until the very end. But also at the delivery woman, like what's wrong with her? Why is she leaving me waiting? Et cetera, et cetera. So
Sure.
is this an example, would you say?
There are situations where the narcissist flashes back, literally flashes back to the childhood in which they were crushed psychologically. And so they're triggered affectively, anger, rage, a resentment, indignation, and they get angry. But then they start to remember the thoughts they had when they were a child. I'm a loser. No one loves me. And these windows don't open often with narcissists. They rarely open off with narcissists. More often than not, that window is closed and you
Yes.
just get the narcissistic injury. So in the case of this person, he was so subjectively hurt,
Mhm.
it flashed him back to the origins of the rage, which is the core shame.
Yeah.
Core shame is a belief that you are fundamentally bad, wrong, not likable, not lovable. And I've seen this with people with narcissistic injuries. I've been in relationships where they have this moment where they're actually connecting. You can almost see in their face they're the little child again.
Mm.
But that window closes very
Yes.
rapidly. It doesn't stay open long. And for some narcissists, it's rare. What you get instead is the injury. Well, you hurt me. Now I'm going to hurt you because I'm an adult and I can.
Wait, let me clarify that one point because you said what you often get is the injury, but I think what you're describing is, and correct me if I'm off, is what you often get is the rage. Like you don't see the injury, you see the outcome of the injury, which is the
No,
rage.
exactly. There's a name for a lot of psychological phenomena. And so we call a narcissistic injury, what is commonly known as a narcissistic injury, is the experience of harm that is fortified and motivated by rage. So you're not really experiencing the injury. You're experiencing the defense mechanism of they'll hurt you. The injury happens in their mind, unconsciously, reflexively. Something happens, they're either judged or they judge themselves, and then they go back and something makes them feel bad, mistaken, wrong. And the rage is a defense to protect themselves.
Yes, okay.
But the injury is behind the scenes. The narcissist doesn't know the narcissistic injury comes from that source. What they
Yes.
do know is they're going to hurt you because you made it feel bad, except in the cases when I said that window is open, where
Yeah.
they do temporarily, it's a fleeting moment, can access that little child that they used to be.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. There are different presentations and different definitions of narcissism, but one thing that I frequently talk about on my own show is that It's the grandiose structure that really holds them together. Please tell me, I was wondering what your take on that was and if that plays a role in this reaction that we're seeing.
We have to go back and just remember that the narcissist and what you're seeing behaviorally, reactively, is coming from another source. Someone who has good mental health, who loves themselves, and they have a reaction to disappointment, well, that comes from the sum total of all their experiences going all the way back to their childhood, and they might be patient, they might be frustrated or slightly angry. Well, that can be traced all the way back to someone that had a secure attachment, that learned that bad things don't happen all the time to them. So when a narcissist gets activated, the rage, the need to punish is their adult version to deal with what happened to them as a child, that they're not going to be pushed around. So that's the anger, but sometimes there's indignation. When we're talking about the entitlement, the grandiosity, what you're dealing with is the reaction to what happened to them so long ago, where they felt horrible, they felt invisible, they were hurt, abused, neglected. And so that the only way that they learned to survive as a little one, that eventually grew up to who they were, was to fold in on yourself and be the only person that's going to make you feel good. That is a survival mechanism of a person with a narcissistic personality disorder, is to somehow convince yourself that you're not this terrible person, that you're good and you deserve things. And that comes out just very distorted in the grandiosity, in the entitlement. It's all an attempt to make themselves feel good when down deep inside they feel terrible about themselves.
Let me jump in because now I'm having all sorts of thoughts. So let me just
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the grandiosity, I was curious about this piece because this example that we're using of Frank, right? The way he introduces it is he says, what a grandiose prick I was, which means I was so full of rage at this grocery delivery woman, that I wanted to tear into her as soon as she arrived. When we unpack that slowly, I know because I see this so frequently in my own practice, is what we hear is, to your word, a sense of entitlement, right?
Entitlement is a sense of domination. Okay, so they're activated. So something happens that activates them, that presses the button of anger, rage, resentment. That activation connects to what's unconscious, that hurt, broken little child that was crushed, neglected, abused. And so when someone is frustrating them, they have to come up with a narrative that they are the victim and that person deserves to be hurt, because that is how they coped. Dysfunctionally, yes. As a child, there was no love. There was no respect. There was no tenderness. There was no nurturing. The way the child coped in such a horrible attachment environment was to be all of everything to himself and to protect himself. And all he has is that. And as an adult, you have power. You can be abusive. You can be intimidating. You can cut people off. And that reaction, the narcissistic injury, is how they justify their distorted thinking. How dare you do that? How could you ignore me? How could you look at me with such contempt?
Yeah.
I mean, you're the bad person, and let me show you.
Yeah, how could you keep me waiting like this? So then they become the bad, I use this word, but I just think of object relations theory, but they become the bad object, right? So now everything bad is in them.
That bad object is distinctly connected to their childhood experience of the harm that they endured. So they have so much rage about their upbringing, their parents, the way they were brought up, so much rage that they have to disconnect it. They have to disassociate from it. It's too big. But when you have the injury provokes the rage. The rage is projected onto the person who now, as an adult, the narcissist believes he can control or hurt. It's their very, very rudimentary and ineffective way of protecting themselves.
Yeah, and a way of life, I would imagine, too, to go back to something I mentioned earlier when I said it's the grandiose structure that holds the narcissist together. They are already in a state because there's an expectation that that delivery woman is going to show up on time. People will be there for them. If they're not there or they're running late, or to your point, they don't smile or whatever it might be, that could be, see, it doesn't happen, no, but it could be the beginning of the collapse of the whole grandiose structure. But to your point earlier, but we don't necessarily see that. what we see is the compensatory movement, which would be the defense of there's the narcissistic rage. Let me get this whole thing back under control. I'm the strong one. I'm going to throw my weight around. I'm the omnipotent one. So there's no injury. There's no pain. There's no hurt at that moment.
Right. You literally have to imagine. It's hard to imagine sometimes that the child that they used to be exists in their unconscious, subconscious mind. It is disassociated from their awareness. It is placed in the limbic system, specifically the amygdala. And that terrible rage, anger, hatred that was a consequence of their childhood, that was put away because it's so big. The brain decides, just like with PTSD, other trauma, the brain decides this is too big to handle consciously. We got to put it away. So they grow up with terrible self-esteem, but because of the compensatory nature of narcissistic personality disorder, they convince themselves that they are good, better, lovable, without flaw. That is the only way that they can soothe themselves to keep the shame at bay. So if someone hurts them, whether real or imaginary, and this happens a lot with people with borderline personality disorder, that injury happens, it connects to the rage, and it's expressed through, we already talked about a rage, but it's also expressed with grandiosity. How dare you? I am this person. No one treats me that way.
Yes.
Or entitlement. It is an expression of the adult version of the child who couldn't protect themselves. So now they hyper protect themselves, have this hyper inflated belief system about how great they are. It is how they cope and how they manage that shame. But they don't know it. They actually believe it in the grandiose and entitlement parts of their self.
Okay, let's step back and then push forward because
Okay.
I want to ask you, but we'll do this by way of a little bit of review. What
Sure.
exactly is happening psychologically? So we have a shift, right? So we have a grandiose structure. We have a moment like that window that you mentioned of injury or what we could call vulnerability. It disappears very quickly. And what we see on the surface, the manifest presentation is one of rage.
Right.
But I want to ask you, what specifically is happening psychologically? You mentioned something a moment ago that I want to pick up on. You mentioned the word projection. And I wanted to go into that a little bit more to understand what role that plays in this whole dynamic.
Let me try to answer this question. If you're intuitive, especially if you're a former codependent or someone who has self-love deficit disorder, which I had, and you're intuitive and you're empathetic, you can read people's faces. When you're with a narcissist who's in a good mood, and all of a sudden you do something that upsets them, and you are tuned into affect. Affect is the psychological term that it's emotions expressed physically. And all of a sudden, their affect shifts from, say, happy to really angry, enraged, upset. It is this immediate shift. It's like, boom. So it goes back to they are activated. They feel bad. They feel embarrassed. They feel humiliated, whether it's right or not. And it activates the narcissistic injury, and it comes out with rage and hurt. So when we're talking about projection is another defense mechanism that the brain allowed them to have to survive the problem, because they were just innocent little kids who didn't deserve to be hurt as bad as they were. They had no one protecting them. All they had were these inner psychological defense mechanisms, strategies to somehow turn reality around to make them believe something positive. So projection is when you attribute something about yourself that you cannot accept, that's beyond your own acceptance or ability to accept, onto someone else. You see yourself in others, but you don't know it. So a narcissist who projects will get angry at someone who they believe is selfish, someone who is self-centered. They will see it in other people and get very, very angry. And really what they're talking about is themselves. That person might be, say they're the partner who's in therapy with me, who's starting to set boundaries and says, well, I want to go out with my girlfriends. You always have time out. The injury connects to the rage. And the part of the defense structure is now to project, is to put it on them. You are selfish. You are self-centered. All you can think about yourself. They're really talking about themselves.
Yes.
But it gives them in that moment this sense of strength. Remember, defense mechanisms provide feelings of relief and strength. They might not be functional. They might not be healthy. But it's the only way that the narcissist can manage that much shame is to put it outside of themselves onto other people.
Mm-hmm.
And we already talked about the other defense strategy is to hurt someone that you believe is hurting you. Projection is a very faulty and unfortunately not very effective way to protect the narcissist.
Just a couple of points on that. So one is, I typically like to think of these defense mechanisms on a continuum. Some are more primitive. I don't use the word primitive in a pejorative way, but they distort reality and impact relationships more than higher level defenses. And projection happens to be one of the more what we call primitive, early. This means early level defenses.
Right. Yeah, I say it a little bit differently and the same. It's instead of primitive, I see it as basic that relates to the childhood experience of rage and harm. It's basic. A lot of defense mechanisms are less primitive. They have evolved with us as we get older, and we learn ways to cope with reality, with frustration, with anger. But primitive has its place of origin in their childhood. It goes back to the earliest parts of their life when they were in their crib and no one picked them up and cuddled them or fed them.
Yeah.
Or when they were toddlers, someone yelled at them, or teenagers, someone abused them. That rage comes from that early primitive source of their psychological development.
So this is a digression. You don't have to comment on this one, Ross, but I just want to share something that crossed my mind. So people often say to me, how is it you do it? How is it you work with these narcissistically disturbed patients? They're so difficult. And I don't see them that way, and this is one example of it. So even if we take something like projection, which seems so destructive, another way to conceptualize it is if you feel hurt or humiliated and you're trying to make, in Ross's example, your wife or your spouse feel something that you cannot own, in a way, it's a way to make a connection with somebody. I know that sounds crazy to most people listening, but they cannot articulate how they feel. They don't have the words. They don't have the capacity for what we call symbolization. So one way to do it is to make the spouse feel a certain way in the hope that they will then feel finally understood. Now, listen, I know it doesn't work that way, Ross, but...
but let me go with you. So you're right on something. So now we're talking about the relational aspects of the narcissistic injury. And we're also talking about the human magnet syndrome. And that's the name of my book that explains why opposite people are attracted to each other, why the caregiver needs the caretaker, while the giver needs the taker. The patient needs the inpatient. It's the dance, like a tango. The two opposites fit together. And so narcissists, codependents fit together.
Ross was just beginning to introduce an idea that really deserves its own space. How these dynamics don't exist in isolation, but in relationships. In his book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, he explores why opposite patterns, the giver and the taker, are often drawn to each other, and how that, and I quote, dance keeps repeating itself. Stay tuned. Next week, I'll be releasing the second part of my conversation with Ross, where we go deeper into why these opposites attract and, importantly, how that dynamic gets worked through in treatment. I also ask him more directly about his clinical approach, and this is where things get a little tense. So stay tuned for that next week. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Dakota podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.